I think I've mentioned it to you a time or two, but back in April, during our time of isolation, I started reading the book The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. There was a few reasons that I can remember or think of that I read this book. And first was I enjoyed reading it back in high school, but I didn't remember a lot about it. I knew, of course, that it was about the Great Depression, which was another angle that I had in reading it. It was a time of hardship and uncertainty, and that seemed to be where we were heading as a country and really as a world, with everything as we got started to hear more and more about the coronavirus. And so I started reading it, and it was great. It was one of those books that I wouldn't quite say couldn't put it down, but something like that. And if you don't know the story well, as I referenced, it's a historical fiction book written in 1939 about a family, the Joad family, who lived in Oklahoma. They had been farmers for a few generations, and at that point in time, they were about bankrupt and were losing their farm. And so, like so many other people in that part of the country, between the Dust Bowl and the drought and the Depression, they were looking for something bigger and better. And so they took up an opportunity and headed west in an old jalopy. I can only imagine what it looked like for them and so many others that were on the trail, so to speak, from the Great Plains states like Oklahoma out to California. And it tells their story of the Okie. And the Okie was a derogatory term given by people who saw these people as threats. They were coming to take their jobs. They were ruining the market, and they just saw them as second-class citizens. And so just a good read for me, really just got me to think about how bad I thought I had it at the time, or maybe you did too, but during that time, they really had it bad. They were scrambling to find a meal each day, to have a place to lay their head at night. But one theme in the book that really stood out to me that kept coming out through the pages was the interdependence of human beings. The way that we're connected, no matter what our histories are, there's a connectivity between humans. You see, throughout the book, this family interacts with all sorts of people going through many of the same scenarios, poverty and hardship and disillusionment with the way that their life is turning out. And so they often end up doing life together with pockets of people. They share food. If someone had work today or enough to buy food, they shared it with their neighbor. They played music together. That was their entertainment. They didn't have most of the things that we have today. And so they got together and sang. They did their laundry at the same time, oftentimes in a river or some difficult place. They shared where the work was because they were migrant farmers for the most part, and so they let each other know who might be hiring, and they let people know where to avoid. They did life together. Most of all, I'd characterize it by they just showed care for their neighbor. It made me think of my own love for my neighbor. We live in a world that doesn't always think of neighbor so well. We like, in our American spirit especially, we like our independence. We don't always love our interdependence. And yet, it reminded me of the teachings of Jesus, who so often taught about the love of neighbor, about the connectivity that we have with our fellow mankind. Jesus told the famous parable of the Good Samaritan, that he was teaching friends who their neighbor was and how they were to treat him or her. Jesus taught us that we are to love our neighbor as much as we love ourselves, that we're to love even our enemies. Jesus, as his end of life was getting nearer, he prayed for our unity. He prayed for the unity of his followers. And that still rings true today. And so if this situation of COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's taught us that mankind does not have control over much. We thought we did, right? We thought that most of our lives had a lot of certainty around them. And if you're anything like me, that's one of the hardships that I'm facing. the things aren't the way that we're used to, the way that they've always been. You see, we've learned, right, that we could lose our health in an instant, and maybe you have family members who have struggled with this. We've learned that we could lose our retirement accounts in an instant. We could lose our job in an instant. But there is one thing that we can control in all of this, and that is the way that we treat one another. The ability that we have, then, we can control the ability to sympathize with someone who's going through a difficult time, to sympathize with others who have it worse than we do. We have the choice to treat every person that we meet with kindness, with respect, and with dignity, no matter who they are, no matter where they came from, and now even more so, no matter what color their skin is. Why do we recognize this? Is it just because we're good human beings? No, it's because as Christians, first and foremost, we know that we are created in the image of God. We've been told that from the beginning, back to Genesis. And that then should influence us and remind us that every single person that we come into contact with on the earth today is also made in the image of God. Let's act like it. Pray with me if you would. God, we thank you for Jesus sharing what it means to love a neighbor, teaching us who a good neighbor is in the parable of the Good Samaritan, challenging us to love even our enemies, whether that be someone that we work with or a country that sees the world differently than we do, someone who doesn't believe the same thing that we do from a religious perspective. Help us to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. Help us to treat others with dignity, to stop and listen more than we speak. Lord, may we be shiners of light to a dark and hurting world right now. Amen.